Welcome, everybody. I just wanted to try something new, see if we could figure out a way that this could feel just a little bit more like real class. So we're going to be starting out our next unit. And our next unit, although we were originally going to do the art analysis next, our next unit is actually going to be the speech analysis because I think we all felt a little hesitant about doing the art analysis online. So I'm hoping we'll be able to be together to be able to do the art analysis. But I guess there's no guarantees, so we're going to start trying this way out. So this first thing that we're going to be doing is the speech analysis. And for the speech analysis, you're going to be finding a speech that you decide on. It can be any speech you want. And you're going to be analyzing it. And what I mean by analyzing is you're going to be deciding whether or not the speech was effective. And in order to decide whether or not something is effective, you have to make some decisions. You have to kind of break it down into pieces and say, first of all, what were they trying to accomplish? What was the goal? And then after deciding what their goal was, you have to decide whether or not they actually effectively met their goal. And you decide that by breaking it down into all of the different things that they did. And so what we're going to be doing is looking at some speeches throughout this and sort of trying to figure out what it was that the speech makers, that the speakers were trying to accomplish. And, who was their audience? Who was their intended audience? And whether or not they've actually effectively done what they were supposed to. And we have to acknowledge that sometimes the audience isn't really a bunch of high school kids. So we have to think about that pretty in depth. So I actually have this speech that I want you to watch. And if you didn't watch it before you started this whole slideshow, I really want you to go back and I want you to watch this speech because nothing else is going to make much sense in all of this unless you watch it. So I have it, actually, I have it's just a YouTube speech, and you can look up this. Uh, Here, I also have linked it on Schoology. So if you can't like get to the link here, you can definitely go to Schoology. And then the first and foremost thing that you have to ask is this question. As you're reading it, you're going to say, was this a good speech? Okay. And then we're going to talk about why this was or was not a good speech and kind of break it down into its different parts. But I'm going to just advise you right now that if you haven't actually watched the video yet, that none of the rest of the slideshow is going to make a whole lot of sense unless you do. So please make sure that you go and watch this speech. And by the way, you're allowed to laugh. It's funny. So hopefully now you've actually watched the speech. And this is where we have to sit down and say, was what was it an effective speech? And I imagine you probably said, not really. Okay, that's usually what people say to me. So we have to say, okay, so why was this not? And some things he did were not terrible, although it wasn't a good speech. Um, so we have to say first and foremost is ask the big question, and that's what was his topic, what was his purpose, who was his audience, and would he have convinced them? And so we have to start out right away. What was the speech about? What was he intending on doing? And how far in was it before you figured it out? Sometimes you don't really know the purpose of a speech, especially if it's informative, until maybe the end of the speech or quite a ways into the speech. But in this speech, that's not really the case. He tells us right at the beginning, and that's an effective way of doing things. Letting people know this is what I'm here and this is what I'm here for is totally okay. And we know right from the beginning that he wants to be the Stark County Treasurer, right? So, and this is Stark County, Ohio, just so you know. And so we say, okay, we knew that. We knew it right away. He said it right away. And then we have to ask the question of what was the purpose of the speech? And this is almost always one of these two things. It's either to inform or to persuade. Once in a while you get an argumentative piece too, but usually it's to inform or to persuade. And we said that he wasn't really just telling us, informing us would be telling us what the job of the Stark County treasurer was, something like that. But that's not really what he was looking for. He was looking to persuade us. He wanted us to say, I think he'd be a great nominee for Stark County treasurer. And he worked really hard at that. I mean, he used a lot of different motions, and he changed his voice a lot, and he got really, really into it. And so, I think he was definitely trying to persuade us. And maybe not us. He's actually trying to persuade the people in the room. Sort of like we currently are watching elections and are watching people trying to become the Democratic nominee to go against Trump. And as they're doing those and as they're going through things, they're really trying to persuade other Democrats that they're the right person. Now, they're not really worried about the Republicans. At the very end here, they're starting to worry about the Republicans because they need to get all those swing voters. But overall, they're trying to get other Democrats to agree that they're the best person for the job. And here he's trying to get the people, the Republicans in the room with him for his county to decide he's the guy. He's the one that should run. And here's where the question becomes sticky, because now all of a sudden we have to say, did it persuade you the way that the speaker intended? Well, that's difficult because now we have to say, well, what did he intend? And I'm not sure if what he intended is what came across. I'm sure he intended to look like he was, full of energy and he really wanted this position and that he understood what he was up against. And I'm sure that's what he wanted, but I'm not sure that's what I got out of it. In fact, I probably missed at least half of what he was saying because I was just so amused at the antics he was using. And you can hear it by some of the other people in the room, when he asks for them to who said that? When he talked about desperate times took desperate measures. And so that's when we have to ask this question. Did it persuade you another way? And this is where I would say probably, at least for me. I sat there and said, oh my goodness, he's crazy. Right? And I don't think he wanted people to think he was crazy. I'm pretty sure he just wanted you to think that he was a good guy for the job. So was his topic clear? Yes. But this is where we now have to talk about our speaker's credibility. Okay, so that's the next thing. Did they show that they are credible, that they are a person that should be respected and listened to? And this really comes down to talking about their ethos, right? That's what we're talking about here. Now I'm writing with a mouse, so please forgive the terrible handwriting. Okay, but this is really where we're talking about ethos, and we really have to evaluate this. Does our guy have ethos? And this is, did he get people to listen to him? We know we have two different types of listeners. We have people who are emotional, and these are the people who are going to be really into pathos. And they want the stories, they want that's how most people are run, and so they want stories, they want illustrations, they want examples. Did he, in fact, connect with the emotional listener? And we have to think about, did he try to? I want you to think about that for a minute. Did he have any stories or illustrations? He did have a lot of energy. He did really get into it. So he might maybe connect with people. The other thing is, we also have our fact finders. The people are like, well, that's all fine and dandy with all the emotional mumbo jumbo, but I want I want facts. I want numbers. I want statistics. I want to prove that, you're not going to move me with your one little story about something. And that means that those are the people who are going to be looking for data. They're going to be looking for numbers. They're going to be looking for trends. They're going to look for specific information. Um, they want to see that they reveal their sources and they want to see quotes. And so my question is did he prove with data, numbers, examples that he should be the Stark County Treasurer? And again, I'm not really sure he got there. He definitely said that he's learned things, and he did tell us a little bit on this ethos bit. He did tell us about his master's degrees and his background that way. I thought it was funny. He has a master's in communication. I'm not sure how he got through public speaking, but anyhow, that's a whole different story. I'm not sure that he really got that. The emotional listener, he might even seem a little scary to a lot of those emotional people. Or he might get somebody really riled up and think, hey, that's the guy I want, someone who's going to get that riled up. But the fact finder, I don't know, aside from the background of who he is, that we really got what we needed to see here. He doesn't tell us about things that he's done. He doesn't tell us about his background information or his service he's done in the past. He doesn't tell us sources. So he's really kind of missing on this piece. So this is one of the places where we can say, yep, he's really not, this might not be the guy, or at least this might not be a good speech. Oddly enough, he did in fact get it. I know that sounds a little strange, but I'm sure that it was not based on this speech that he got this position. And then you have to think about the next thing. Organization. Was the speech easy to follow? Could you tell where he was going? Did you know what he was talking about? Could you follow him? And I would say, for the most part, yeah, I pretty much could give him credit on this. Was it easy to follow? Yeah, I knew what he was talking about. I was never lost. I was a little not sure about him, but I knew what he was saying. Were his topics well organized? Yeah, I felt like it was all one topic the whole time. There were little bits and pieces where he talked about, politics is winner take all and all those other things. So, I mean, I wouldn't say this is where he really lost it in the speech. It really wasn't that bad when it came to that. And even his transitions, I could follow him. It wasn't really a problem there. Know your audience. And this is going to be important when you give your speech with your senior project at the end, but it's also what you're going to be doing to look at to say, what about somebody else? Do they know who their audience is? In that room, that video, there's a couple different videos of it, but it's all pretty much from that same video. But you can tell that the other people in the room it's a small room. When other people responded to him, he heard it right away. People felt like it was a fairly intimate space. So he was dealing with the people who were making the choice of who was going to be their treasurer. So that is his intended audience. He knew ahead of time who they were. So when you think about who's making the decisions in a town or in a county for who's going to run the county and actually deal with all the money of there, you have to think about what is the educational level. And this is probably a fairly educated group. Usually we don't have people who don't know what they're doing running our political offices. I know sometimes you can take that for what you want. I'm sure we all have our own opinions on that, but usually they're fairly educated. And is he talking to experts or novices? Is he talking to people who know what's going on, or is he talking to people who don't have a clue what's going on? And he has to really inform them of everything. And in this particular speech, I would say the answer to that is that these are experts. These are people who know what's happening in their county. They know what's going on. So that's not really a problem. How intimate is the space? And this is where I was talking, like this is a small space that he was in. And so we have to think about things like, are they talking to thousands of people? Are they talking to tens of people? In this speech, I would definitely say he's speaking to the tens. You know, he's probably got 10, 20 people in that room. It is certainly not thousands. And so that's going to affect how you give a speech. I'm not sure that his volume or tone was appropriate. I mean, he's literally like squeaking sometimes when he's speaking, and he's loud and shouting in a few different spots. His tone is sort of all over the place. He's very aggressive in some places. In other places, he's almost overly trying to be nice, when he was like political, you know. So that's something for you to think about. And is the speaker altering the speech appropriately for the audience? And this word here, this appropriate word, I think is the one that we really have to focus on. Is this appropriate or is this not? And I think our problem with this is that it is so radically inappropriate that it just seems almost weird. So, so that's what we can say if we were going to really talk about this for him. And then there's the delivery. Delivery is the way that you actually say the speech. Now, this is a hard one to write about because I think when you're looking through this whether or not the volume was right. Is the volume just a way to be heard, or did they stress certain ideas? Now, he certainly stressed certain ideas. I'm just not sure what it is. So if you're actually writing a paper and you're doing this, which of course you're going to be doing, you need to say in the moments where he got really, really loud in his volume or his articulation. So I know I think of the winner take all, okay? He got super loud. He was shouting. He was leaning toward his audience and almost yelling. So that's the point where I would say if I needed to explain it to someone who hadn't seen the speech, I'd have to say in the moment where he used the quote, winner take all, he became very loud, very aggressive, and even leaned toward his audience in an aggressive manner, which was completely inappropriate for what he was trying to do. So that's where I would say how you're going to talk about this in a paper is you have to actually say the quote of what words were being said in the moment where he gets really loud. I know this seems a little bit weird, but you really have to do this in order for people to be able to understand what you're talking about. We also have to talk about articulation. And articulation, we already talked about volume, but articulation was he mumbling, or could you hear his emphasis, or could you understand what he said? And of course, none of the other stuff matters if we can't hear them or if we can't understand them. And so that's something that's important. Another thing that's very important to whether or not something is good is whether or not it is, and here is one of these keywords, memorable. Do you remember it? Now, you've probably watched a lot of the goofy advertisements on television, and a lot of those are really silly. And you're like, what on earth did that have to do with Old Navy? Or what did that have to do with car insurance? Or what did that have to do with whatever? Fill in the blank. Okay? And sometimes it has almost nothing to do with it, but it's memorable, right? Progressive car insurance has nothing to do with ice skating, and yet it is memorable. And so that's why they do it. Now here, this is a fairly memorable speech. I'm probably always going to remember it. But of course, that's when you have to say, well, why? Why am I remembering it? And if I'm remembering it because it was completely ridiculous and I did not actually have any respect for the guy at the end, and it was something where I was supposed to, well, that's when we say, well, again, we take that back to, well, in the end, we said this was not a good speech. And of course, the final thing is that question, is it appropriate? And that's the big question, and it was not appropriate. And that's where our guy, Mr. Davidson, completely loses it, right? So that being said, then we finally get to the last bit, and visual aids is not really appropriate to this one. He didn't really have any graphs or charts or pictures, but if somebody uses one in what you have, or they bring something on stage, or they have some sort of a prop or anything like that, you have to address it because those are things that are designed to help you understand what they're trying to say just a little bit better. And usually it's to make some sort of emphasis. Um, and so you have to think about graphs, charts, pictures. In our speech, we would kind of leave that out because there weren't any. Um, and are they necessary? Do they aid in your understanding? Um, and of course, there's this. When the speaker is too reliant on them, we've all been to somewhere where we've seen a PowerPoint presentation, or we've been, and all they do is read the slides. There's no stories, there's nothing, and you're like, well, I could have read the slide too. I didn't really need that. And so if that's how you're feeling, then that's somebody who's too reliant on their presentation materials. And of course, the big question always is, did it enhance the overall presentation? If it doesn't enhance the presentation, then it's probably taking your attention away from what's being said. And so that's probably an indication that it was not very well done. And then, of course, we have to think about their movements. And again, this is hard to talk about, but I think about in the moments where he says, instead of a tool, and he puts his arm up there, I'll use it as a weapon, right? He had movements. He was walking all over the stage, and I would say that, he was, sometimes he moved away from his podium, and that made him actually forget what he was supposed to say, like his most favorite line in the history of the spoken language, and then he screwed it up, right? Um, so he did move, and he did move around, and I would even say that he intended for it to be purposeful. He wanted you to remember those things, he wanted to emphasize the ideas, and he had clearly thought about it. The next question, though, of course, is it distracting or is it helpful? And this is where I think he probably lost it, right? So when he says a tool or a weapon, I don't really need someone putting a pretend screwdriver in my face. Now I'm thinking about, why are you doing that? Or if he's leaning in and shouting at me in an aggressive manner, I'm thinking, oh my goodness, do I need to get out of the room? So I wouldn't say it was helpful, but in lots of speeches it is. So you have to kind of take those moments whenever someone does motions or something that's different than what they've done for the rest of the speech and say, well, what was the reason? Were they doing it just because they were nervous? Because that's not helpful. Or were they doing it for a purpose? And here I would say it was purposeful. However, it was distracting and not really helpful. And so then you have to say, then, is it appropriate? And again, the problem with why it wasn't helpful is because it was not appropriate. In a small setting, you don't need to make people feel uncomfortable. And I think he clearly did that. So again, if you're going to talk about those movements, you have to say, when he said this is what he physically did. And then talk about how that movement or that motion really helped or did not help the actual essay or the actual speech itself. And then, of course, once you've figured all of that out, once you've got it decided, yes, it was a good speech, no, it was not, and you figured out their motions, you figured out what their purpose was, you figured out what went wrong, you figured out what went right, you give them credit where credit is due, you say where it wasn't. Then you have to actually write your paper. And I'm just going to go over this fairly quickly because I don't want to take too much more of your time. But you're going to organize the paper as an introduction. You're going to make a hook. What's going to get people interested? Why should they care about your speech? Why does this matter? You're going to say who gave it, where, and when it was given. That should be really important information, and any necessary background information that's needed. And then, of course, and then tell what did they intend on doing. So this guy wanted to be the Stark County treasurer. That was his purpose. But my thesis is not what his purpose of his speech was, but it's whether or not that purpose was actually met. And then you're going to use your basis of analysis. You're going to say, because he used inappropriate motions and inappropriate voice and tone, it took away from all of the meaning of his speech, and therefore it was not a well done speech. And you're going to do that, and that's what we mean by your basis of for analysis. And then in the body, each one of those has to have a purpose. Now, I don't care what you decide. You can say, first we want to talk about his lack of ethos, pathos, and logos. Okay, cool. And another one you might decide to say, another reason why this was because of his audience awareness or because of his lack of organization, although it was fairly organized, so I would kind of leave that alone. And then another one might be about his delivery and his actual way of speaking. And the next one would be physical presentation, what he did. And you have to talk about each one of those. So each one of your paragraphs should be about those. And you should use specific examples. You can't just say his voice was inappropriate. You have to tell me when and where and how it was. And then transition smoothly into the next topic. Finally, you'll have a conclusion where you're going to remind the audience of all the major points and remind people of your thesis, and then have a final statement. And your final statement should pretty much connect to that first hook statement that you had at the very beginning. So all of those things will come together, and then you should be able to have something. And then, of course, the final thing, and I always get questions, and first of all, people will ask me, how do I cite this? Now, you don't need to have 3 citations for this paper. You only need to have your speech. You may have more. So if you need something more in order to prove what you're saying, then go find it. But if you watched it on YouTube, or you watched it on TED, or you watched it on American Rhetoric, which is another great one if you like historical speeches. If you went to one of those places, you're going to see that it's on a website. So then you cite it as a website. You do not cite it as a speech. You're going to use MLA documentation as you always do. And the only way you document something as a speech is if you physically go and watch the speech. We're living in some crazy times right now. You can do something that is happening right now. You can do like one of Cuomo's or Trump's speeches now, or you can do something, like I said, from any of those other sites. But anyhow, I really hope that all of this helps. I hope this gives you a clear idea of where you're going and what you need to do and what you need to start looking for. We are going to do a couple more together before we're all done with this, and then we'll let you look for some stuff on your own. So anyhow, I hope that this is helpful, and I hope we can see each other again sometime soon.